Okay, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are watching this. So I just wanted to go through, clues in the title obviously, it's about communication with others. Now it's a short exam to do. You do, however, though, have to be careful with these short exams. So whilst you might look at it and go, oh, it's not many questions, that's quite straightforward. You come and sit here and think, actually, yeah, it's a bit more difficult because I've got less sort of leg room, shall we say, to be able to miss a few questions, or to you're trying to balance, aren't you, whether you're getting them right or wrong and what you'd require out of the test. So you do have to be careful. It's also not one of the exams that you can't revise for. I mean, every exam, this sounds obvious, every exam you should revise for regardless. So just to be a little bit careful, but I'll go through all the criteria again as I normally would do. People have said to me that they've found the videos useful, so thank you for the feedback, and if it does help, which it sounds like it's doing, then great stuff, fantastic. You can watch it more than once if you really need to, and so the best way to do it is by making notes as you go through. And the ones of you that have followed the video and made your notes, and then gone and done some of the other practice tests that we've done, have come out really well. So I think there's probably an idea behind that, isn't there? If you think about it, if you watch it, and then go from there. So that's it. Right, I'm going to go through criteria because there's a bit to do, and I don't want it to be a huge video at the same time. So what have we got then? This is identifying key roles of the site management team, and it goes through a list of different traits and areas, shall we say. So I'm going to go through each one, explain in a very, very quick nutshell what each one does, and hopefully that can inform you when you come to do your exam. So the first one is the architect. What does the architect do? Well, an architect is the person that's going to design a building, isn't it? So for example, if I had, let's say I had loads of money, which isn't true, but if I did, be highly unlikely, but if I did, I could employ an architect to design a building for me. I'd obviously have to have the ideas. I can't just say to him, here you go, just design me a house. There'll be a specification, won't there? There'll be something that I want. There'll be a locational area. Where is it? Is it in relation to being south facing on the front or the back, so on and so forth. The architect is going to design those buildings. So every new build, there will be architects there that have done all the design work for them. They employ somebody called a draftsman, and they complete the drawings for them, and then obviously the approval gets signed off by the client, doesn't it, and the architect, and so on and so forth. So that's what the architect's there to do. He'll come and have a look at the work in progress, but he's not there on a day-to-day basis on the site. He doesn't need to be. He can be office-based. So he's the person that's going to do the designs based upon a client's request, which makes sense. So that's what it is in a nutshell. Then you have project manager stroke clerk of works. So I'll go through what project manager is, then clerk of works. They are very closely aligned, but let's just be careful with the terminology. So you do have to be careful when you read the question. So just bear that in mind. A project manager. Okay, a project manager is a person that's managing the whole project start to finish. So again, for another example, if you are working in a house that's being renovated, the person that maybe owns the house that's being renovated by lots of different trades coming in and so on and so forth is the project manager. They're managing the project from start to finish. They're also ensuring that the quality of work is up to standard. So whatever the person's they've employed them to come in and do, they're going to quality check it afterwards and make sure everything's satisfactory and is fine. They're also there to make the decisions, aren't they, as well, at the end of the day as the project manager. So there might be an issue surrounding where a radiator is installed, for argument's sake. The project manager would say to the plumber yes or no in terms of what ideas there would be. So they're going to make some form of decisions. Now a clerk of works is again the same as what I've just said, but the way to think of a clerk of works is this. Now clerk of works sometimes work on contracts. So that what a contract is this, and I explained what I'm trying to explain to you. If you work on a contract, I used to work on contract work. It would sometimes be through a local authority or through a housing association, and you would go and install a number of heating systems or a number of their properties, and that's under their contract. So you'd be contracted to fit that heating for that particular property, or however many properties over a year or 2 year period. And a clerk of works is the person that would follow up that work. So for example, if I'd fitted 3 central heating systems in we used to do it in a week. I'd be able to do that now, and the back wouldn't take it at all. I'd be struggling for a week, to be honest. But if we fitted 3 a week, maybe 2 of the 3 jobs the clerk of work would visit, and he'd visit to check it to make sure one is compliant with standards, and we'll talk about standards and legislation shortly, but also he's there to quality check it and to give it the overall sign off. And obviously, the more jobs he visits that you've installed, and the quality remains the same all the way through, the less likely he's going to be looking at most of your jobs. It'll risk rate it and take you downwards. If, however, he finds that some jobs are unsatisfactory, he'll give you something called a snagging list. And what that is a list of items that need to be looked at and resolved, and you probably need to go back to the job to do it. And it's not to say if you have a snagging list that you haven't done what you should have done properly. There might have been little bits that have been missed, or there's some alterations, or he actually looks at it and thinks, you know what, this would be better if it was done this particular way. So that's what he's there to do. And he's also there to make sure it's contract compliant. So what I mean by that is, if in the contract it says you must speed fit pipework under the floor of the circuit, and you fitted copper, he's obviously going to look at it and go, well, what are you doing? It's not in the contract, you need to go and put it back into speed fit. So that's what he's also there to do. So think of those two roles. They are similar, but in my experience, a clerk of works is more for contracts than anything else. Two of those again, excuse me, would relays back to an architect if needed. Okay. Next one is a structural engineer. Okay, what does a structural engineer does? Well, he calculates essentially that and works out what's going to be needed in the property to make it structurally sound. So, for example, if you were to take out what we call a load-bearing wall. So a load-bearing wall is there to support most of the property. But if you wanted to remove it to make it open plan, so on and so forth, you'd have to employ a structural engineer that would tell you how to do it and what you'd need to put in place to keep the building structurally sound. So there's things like RSJs, which you've perhaps maybe seen before and not quite sure of them. They're almost like metal joists, and sometimes they can be installed there that give it the structural support. A structural engineer would also look at any defects in the building. So if, for example, you had a building that had a series of cracks running all the way up through the side of the building with the brickwork, a structural engineer would come along and would assess it. That's how it works. If you had a building that had something called subsidence, and subsidence mean where it sort of is sinking into the ground, usually sort of one way actually, unfortunately. Again, that person would have to be consulted because they would give you what's happened with it, but also would tell you what you need to do, and that's what a structural engineer does. Okay, next one is a surveyor. So surveyors, they come in different shapes and forms, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way of any means or anything. You know, don't think of somebody who's actually got to be quite fat to be a surveyor. It's nothing to do with that at all. What I mean by in terms of shapes and forms, you can have a surveyor, a plumbing surveyor. My old employer used to go and survey the jobs, and it's basically going to somebody's house or wherever the job is, and working out the radiator sizes and working out where the pipework would go, where would the boiler go. So you're surveying the job, you're working it out what would need to be done. Surveyors also can go to properties, and you've got things like building surveyors and all sorts of stuff. So again, they would look at more of the building and structural work. So a surveyor is there to go and have a look at what needs to be done, calculate it, work out a plan, and then they would feed that back into their employer, and that's the way it would go. So that's what a surveyor does. A building services engineer, BSE. So building services engineers, what do they do? Right, so we've got to take you back a couple of steps maybe, because if you're not quite sure what building services is, possibly. I'm sure most of you are, but for the sake of the video we'll do it. Building services suggests what it does on the tin really. You have a building that needs services, and services would include gas, water and electric, and that's what building services is, basically. A building service engineer would be doing the design work that's required for, you know, the central heating system for a property, where with the cold water main, gas main, so on and so forth, electrical supply, blah blah blah. But what they wouldn't necessarily do is do it for a domestic property, because it's pretty standard where things will be going. The building contractor would take care of it. But a building services engineer would design systems for, let's say, for prisons would be a good example of that, because there's lots of different areas and different requirements there. They might have a building services engineer design it for blocks of flats and various other things. So where it becomes more complicated is what I'm trying to say. That's where then a building services engineer would be employed to do all the design work, and obviously that design work would feed into the installation, and away you would go. Quantity surveyors then, right, so it kind of does, if you think about it this way, it does what it says on the tin, and there's loads of videos about quantity surveyors. If you actually have a look, there's a couple of videos that are out there talking about sort of the day in the life of a quantity surveyor, so on and so forth. I want to give it to you simplistically so it's a lot easier. They're about managing costs essentially, and the quantities and the materials that are being used. That's what it is, and I don't think we need to think too more, because they have lots of caveats on top of that. Please don't get me wrong, they do this because they've got a big job, but at QS that's what they're there to do. Next one is a buyer. Now this again depends on your term. They might be called a procurement officer. So a buyer or a procurement officer, and they are the same thing. If you were working for a very large organisation and you were buying lots and lots of materials for whatever reason, you would maybe consider having a procurement officer stroke buyer to negotiate the best prices on bulk buying of material, and that's what they would be there to do. If it's a small plumbing company with 3 or 4 people working for them, the chap or the lady that owns the plumbing firm, they would be doing that procurement process. They would be the person that's doing all that job. So they'd have multiple roles if you want to think of it that way. Larger organisation though could afford to pay somebody to do it, but also the savings substantially that they would potentially make would easily pay for their wages and more. So it's a buyer stroke procurement officer. Next one then is an estimator. Does what it says on the tin. What's an estimator? Well, an estimator is somebody who's going to estimate the price of the job. Now, I'd hate to do something like that, if I'm honest with you. It'd be quite scary, because if you actually got it wrong, it would cost the company thousands and thousands, wouldn't it? And I'm not saying there's people that get it wrong. Estimators are well trained not to get it wrong. So obviously they'll be working out a rough price, and we say rough price. This could run into millions and millions of pounds, couldn't it? It wouldn't be just let's pluck a figure out of the air. It would be let's do a load of work behind it to try and roughly get a good estimate in place that would help for tendering of contracts. So if they overprice it, they're not going to get the work, and if they underprice it, they'll be running at a loss or would struggle to break even. So, but that's what an estimator does. Contracts manager then does what it says on the tin. A contracts manager is there to manage a contract. So a contract might be multiple trades going into a property, as we've already suggested at this point in time, and he would be managing the whole contract from the start to the finish. Now, you might think already on the video, you might be thinking, well, hold on a minute, you've just said project manager, now you're saying contracts manager. The difference is this: a project manager is managing a small project. So it could be a refurbishment of a house, runs out as a contract. A contracts manager will be managing all the contracts, which would be obviously substantially bigger. It'd be more than one property, it'd be hundreds and hundreds of different properties, and that's what the contract manager would do. Contract manager would also obviously liaise with the clerk of works, and the clerk of works would feed back to the contracts manager, and they would be making sure that the project's going to finish on time. Is there a chance they could finish early, etc., etc. Again, a larger company would employ a contracts manager. Last one on this particular 1.1, which is quite extensive, is a construction manager. So what's the construction manager going to do? He's going to be responsible for all of the construction trades on site. So whether it's bricklayers, it's joiners, it's tilers, electricians, it's plumbers, would you say gas fitters? Okay, you could have them separate if you want, because it's within your criteria. They're managing all those different trades, and that's what a construction manager will do. He'll manage a number of trades. Okay. So there's the first bit. So again, hopefully you've got a chance to take notes, and like I say, if you try and just press pause if you struggle with it, so just do it from there. Next one is the key roles and individuals that report to site management team. Quite a bit to do there. So what we got, subcontractors. So what is a subcontractor? Again, quite easy. So if you had a company that basically has won a contract, so let's say for example the company has run a contract for 50 central heating systems to be fitted, and they were unable, with the amount of staff that they have, to get the 50 completed, let's say in a year's time. I'm just again random stuff coming off the top of my head. They might know another couple of plumbers that possibly would be interested in doing the work for them, and those people would subcontract to them. So they would be employed by the company, but not under what we call PAYE. Wouldn't be on the books, they wouldn't be technically employed. They'd be actually subcontracting to that contractor, so therefore they'd be doing the work on the behalf of, but still be self-employed. That's quite prevalent in our industry. That happens quite a lot. And some people, that's all they do. They are just subcontractors, and that's what they do for their living. So that's how you need to perceive that and how to look at that one from there on in. So you've got site supervisor as the next one. So what is a site supervisor? It's just what it says on the tin, really. They're responsible for the whole site, aren't they? They're there to ensure that everything's getting done on time, and they're responsible for possibly the trades as well, depending on what the hierarchy is. The next one is the trade supervisor, which is really the broken down version of the site supervisor. So a trade supervisor, years ago, they used to have them for sort of gangs of bricklayers. And obviously we're not bricklayers, but just to give you the example. And that person would be called a charge hand. And a charge hand is the person that's responsible for that specific set of trades. And on some cases, on some jobs and some building sites, there is always somebody, isn't there, who's classed as a supervisor, so to speak. So if you were working with a couple of plumbers, there'll be one of those that really sort of takes charge from a plumbing point of view. And that's how things normally work out, and that's what you'd have as called a trade supervisor. It goes into the trades now, and I think we would probably suggest we know what a bricklayer does. I think joiner-wise, I think you'd know what a joiner does, isn't it? Yeah. Plasterer, pretty obvious. Tiler, pretty obvious. Electrician, obviously, no problem. H&V fitter. So this is the bit that people get caught with this one. I'm just going to go into this, and the ground worker one as well I'm going to go into, because I think there's a little bit of uncertainty with exactly, not what they do, but what they're responsible to do. Right, H&V, heating and ventilation, that's what it means. A H&V fitter is a plumber, or you could say a pipe fitter if you really wanted to, that's responsible for installing large industrial commercial pipe work. So it wouldn't be the 15 and 22 mil copper as we know, it'd be sort of 4-inch, 5-inch steel pipe work. And that's what a H&V fitter is, heating and ventilation. And when we say in terms of ventilation, it might be for, for example, for a supermarket or somewhere like that, somewhere very, very big, where they need the large bore pipes to do the work. And then used to be called pipe fitters is what they used to be. H&V fitter is another term for it, but there's not that many of them out there that I'm aware of anyway. Gas fitter, I think we know what that is, don't we? Decorator, I'm all sure we know what a decorator is and what they do. Ground worker, that's the other bit I wanted to touch on, what they do. Right, so what are ground workers responsible to do? Well, the clue's in the title, but they're there to obviously help dig out for the drainage system, so anything to do with removing earth from the ground, etc., or making good, they're there to do. Some ground workers will be digging trenches for cold water mains and gas supplies, so on and so forth, and that's what ground workers do. Very, very hard, labour-intensive job, though, to be fair to say, so that's what they're there to do. Okay, we move on to the third block then, so we're looking at the key roles for site visitors. So it gives us a different variety of site visitors here. A building control inspector. So what does a building control inspector do? Well, if you think about the word building control inspector, so what's the control mean? What does that mean? So building control is the build itself with working and compliant with legislation. Is it working alongside building regulations? And what I mean by that is, if there's something particular that's going to be, so let's say drainage, we'll use drainage, the ground workers, let's say the ground workers have put a lot of drainage systems underground because that's what mainly they do. The building control inspector will go and have a look at that to make sure that complies with building regulations. And obviously if it doesn't, then he'll be saying, actually this isn't right, this needs to be sorted X, Y and Z. So there'll be certain parts where the building control inspector is going to come in and have a look at particular things to make sure they are compliant with building regs. Obviously, if you think about drainage, drainage is a big one, isn't it? Because if you mess the underground drainage up on a whole brand new housing estate, you're going to have some callbacks, aren't you? And that wouldn't be good. A water inspector, excuse me, does what it says on the tin. A water inspector is employed by what we call the water undertaker. Now, that's not a wrestler or anything from WWE, but the water undertaker is, for example, in our area, is Severn Trent. And there'll be a water inspector that will go out and he'll be testing and taking samples of the water supply to each property. And it's not to say because it's been done wrong, it's under legislation that has to be done. So obviously they know when they've built a brand new house and estate that the water supply that's going to those new houses is suitable and would be what we call fluid category 1. And that's the idea of it. Next one is a HSE inspector, so Health and Safety Executive Inspector. They're there to do site checks, basically. They're there to make sure that there is compliance in terms of health and safety. If there isn't, they have the authority to close the building site down. They also have powers to put what we call prohibition notices in. So we found this and this wrong, you have 7 days to get it fixed and we're coming back to make sure it's done. And that's how it works. That's basically it. They're not there just to basically shut everything down, don't get me wrong, but they're also there to offer advice and guidance and various other things, but that's the gist of where you are. Electrical services inspectors, so be working for the local power company that's supplying the new builds, and they'll be checking that all the electrical supplies and connections to each property are safe and working perfectly well. So that's the idea with those. So a couple of easy ones there, I'd say. Next one talks about legislation and statutory legislation and guidance and various other things, and I'm going to go through some of these points here. So the first one just talks about legislation. Right, so if it's under legislation, it means it's an act of Parliament, isn't it? It's an act of law. It must be done. When you've got something called an ACOP, Approved Code of Practice, that is different. That's not a legislation. So example, a legislation would be BSEN 806, which is hot and cold water supplies. That's under legislation. That must be followed. It's not optional, it's mandatory, which means you must have to do that. That's what it is. And that's why legislation's there, because it's to keep everybody safe and to ensure that we all have the same standard, whatever we may be doing. And that's the whole idea. Nothing more than that. Next one changes slightly is data protection. Well, we know there's Data Protection Acts, don't we? As well, there's something obviously now called GDPR. So Data Protection Act, as we know, is there to protect your data from being misused by other persons. Data Protection Act, you have to keep all your personal information and documentation if you're a company safe and secure, so it can't be gained by anybody that it shouldn't be. And that's the whole idea behind data protection. Equal opportunities. There's obviously Equal Opportunities Acts as well, isn't it? And they use the keyword act there as an act of Parliament again, which means law. So obviously there is inequalities and diversity is also that obviously as well. There's also an equal opportunities one as well. So again, there's acts of Parliament are there to protect people, but also make sure that everybody, if you think about it, equal opportunities, it makes sense, doesn't it, when you just think about it? Everybody has the same level of access to whatever it may be. That's how it should be. Okay. Health and safety. It's quite easy, isn't it? So you've got Health and Safety Work Act 1974. We know what it's there for. It's to keep everybody safe, and there's loads of subsidiary sections based off the back of it. Every employer should have that labelled at their workplace. Next one is to do with regulations and what regulations are, and it goes into regulations, British standards, and codes of practice. So I'm going to try and just clump three together. So what are regulations? Well, building regulations is a very good one, isn't it? It goes from A to whichever letter. I always forget off the top of my head how far they go, because I only use particular ones. But those building regulations are there for a reason. They're to regulate what is happening. This is the statutory way that you would do it. This is what you need to do. This is the regulation that tells you. And we know that because we look at those regulations. That's the thing. What's the British standard? Well, British standards are, and there's loads and loads of British standards. There's a huge amount. It's under something called BSI, which is British Standard Institution, and that's what all the booklets are labelled after. British standards are also there to give you what you need to do in terms of jobs. So I was just talking about BSEN 806 for hot and cold water. So if there's something you were installing hot and cold water wise, I'm not quite sure. One, you'd either look in water regulations, but also you could look at the British standards and see what that says. British standards, though, are protected in terms of BSI, and what I mean by that is you have to pay a subscription to the BSI to be able to access all the British standards. There's not going to be a plumber that's going to sit there with a library of British standards, etc., and work their way through it. They get updated on sometimes a yearly basis, not always, but sometimes as well, so it can be a challenge to keep up. Codes of practice, so a COP. A code of practice is what we call good practice. It's not legislation, but it's something we try and follow, and that's how that works as a code of practice. It's not legislation. It is just good practice. That's basically what you'd be looking at. Manufacturer's guidance, installation instructions, service and maintenance instructions. Okay, so I'm going to clump those three together. I did on one of my other videos I spoke about manufacturing instructions, and it's the same thing. So if you watch Holistic Exam A or B video, it's the same thing really. What do they give us? They give us installation instructions. So if we're fitting a boiler, it will tell us where it can go, what height it needs to be, where does the flue need to go, what are all the pipework connections, so on and so forth. Servicing and maintenance, it will give you how to service the boiler and any maintenance work that needs to take place. So if you need to change a part on the boiler, you could look in the instruction booklet and find what part number it was and so on and so forth and order it, and that's what it would do. User instructions are obviously important because once you've fitted the boiler, yes, you're going to give them a demonstration of how it works. You're not just going to not show them and say, there you go, your boiler's done, see you later, goodbye. You're going to show them how it works, set the system up with them, but you're going to give them the instruction manual because they're not going to remember, and neither would I, best will in the world of everything you've just said to explain how the system works. So they'll have a chance to read the instructions. They might want to change the time the central heating comes on, or etc, etc. So that's what those instructions would be used for. Okay, going forward then, what have we got? Identify the purpose of information that's used in the workplace. So what is a job specification? Right, so a job specification is this. If I was, let's say, I love these where I think off the top of my head, and I come up with something totally random every single time. But let's say, for example, I was very specific on, we had a job somewhere and I wanted a Worcester boiler, for example. I wanted Stelrad radiators, I wanted 15mm copper, I want everything soldered, no speed fit, don't want any of that, etc, etc. That would form part of a job specification. It's the items that are in there. What's the specification? Is there a particular type of boiler? So I just said a Worcester boiler. Well, there's loads of Worcester boilers. I'd need to be more specific, wouldn't I, as to which one it would be. What I said, Stelrad radiator, is it K1, is it K2, so on and so forth. And it's the list of everything that's used on the job, and the spec is it's the size, the make, the model. That's what you're looking at when you think about a specification. Okay, and that's the idea. Plans and drawings. What do we use plans and drawings for? Well, we have something called an installation plan. Now, you're not going to go to a job and have an installation plan if you're working for a small company. An installation plan could be something that you draw now. So in your portfolios where I've asked you to do your bathroom drawings, that you've drawn an installation plan. Maybe not knowing that that's the title of it, but that's what it is. You've drawn the installation plan. Where's the pipework going? What's it doing? Where does it feed to? That's what it is. So an installation plan could be drawn up there and then on the job. The person that surveyed it, if we go back a number of steps, the surveyor might give you the installation plan if he's a plumber and say, actually, here you go, here's the drawing of where everything's going. Away you go. Big contracts will have an installation plan ready for you, regardless, and that's the whole idea of what it is. You've got something called isometric drawings, which are 3D front rear elevation of a property. We don't tend to use too many of those, but it would show you locations of different points of your guttering, soil stacks, so on and so forth as well. You've got something called a detailed drawing plan, which might be, if we said, what we call a boiler room. So if you think of a large industrial commercial premises, they'll have a room dedicated just for their boilers to be in because they're so big. That's the whole idea. So a detailed drawing plan might show you specifically where all the pipework has to go in relation to the boilers, etc. And you follow that. But because it's in so much detail, it's called a detailed drawing plan. And I think that makes sense. The last one is what we call a site plan. Now a site plan you can see a lot of those actually on the internet, to be fair, site plans. It shows you where the actual building site itself, or the houses that are being built, if you want to think of it that way, where they are within the current location. So for example, if it showed you 50 houses on a bit of a map, it might show you where all the roads are going to go to, where the M1 would be, or whatever main road it would be, where loads of trees are, etc, etc, and where it is in relation to the area, and that's what a site plan is. That's the whole idea. Okay. Work programme. What's a work programme? Dead easy. It's a big chart that will tell you, for example, from week 1 to, let's say, week 30, we'll make it simple. The first, from week 1 to week 10 might be ground workers and bricklayers are in. Then from week 10 to 13, for example, might be joiners. Week 13 to 17 might be plasterers and so on and so forth. But there'll be some point in the work programme where the plumbers go in. And what it's going to show us on a big chart is what weeks different trades are expected to be in and what they should be doing. And by the end of the work programme, all the trades will have been in, and that will help with the completion. So for example, if they're putting foundations in and footings in for a new housing build, well, the plumbers won't be there, will we? Because there's nothing for us to do. So on a work programme, we wouldn't be on that particular week because it's too early in the stage of the construction. And that's how the work programme works. Delivery notes. So for example, if you have something delivered, you've all had stuff delivered. Let's think about it logically. It doesn't have to necessarily be about plumbing, does it? You've all had things delivered, and you might have to tick off on your piece of paper what you've had delivered and make sure, yes, I've had 12 radiators ticked and like that. That's what a delivery note is. This is what you've had. This is what you've ordered. This is what we've delivered. Is it correct? Yes, it is. Tick, tick, tick. Will you sign here, please? Yeah, no problem. Thank you very much. Dead easy, straightforward, isn't it? Nothing difficult there. Timesheets. Right. So again, They're not used for the type of work that I do now. Obviously, in education, we don't use timesheets, but obviously, what we will be thinking about doing at some particular point. Sorry, I've just pressed that on the screen. Obviously, with those timesheets, what we will be thinking about doing with those is when you're using a timesheet, you're listing down the hours that you've worked and where you've worked, and that will obviously help to work with your employer to work out exactly what you need to do, and obviously what he's going to pay you. So if your timesheet's not correct, you're not going to get the right money, are you? That's basically how it works. Okay, policy documentation, health and safety, environmental, customer service. So policy documentation that companies will have, they'll all have a big health and safety policy if they've got 5 or more people, and there'll be loads of information as you've done on the health and safety unit with that one. An environmental policy, it could be how it's impacting the work that they do in the local area and how they're trying to reduce the CO2 footprint. So you've probably heard a lot of that on the news, to be fair. Some bigger companies have something called a customer service policy. That customer service policy will be built up of how complaints can be treated, how inquiries can be treated, etc., etc. And that'll be the idea. Okay, so the next one is identify the purpose of information given to customers. So what we got, quotations. So what is a quotation? It's a price that's given to you by somebody, isn't it? So this is the price for this particular job. That's a quote. The next one is an estimate. Well, I'm estimating it's going to be roughly this much more. What's the problem with the estimate? It's not a fixed price. What's the thing with the quote? The quote is the fixed price. That's how that one works. So if once you've done the job, whether it's a quote or an estimate, and you've done the job, you normally give the person what we call an invoice, which is the next one down. And an invoice is just a request for payment, isn't it? And that's how that one will work. Next one is statutory cancellation rights and handover information. So statutory cancellation rights, when you look at it, whatever you buy, etc., for cancellation rights, get the words out properly, that would always be useful. You have what we call a cooling off period, and it will be different for different products, if that makes sense. Now there is a statutory one normally, which is normally 7 days, and in some cases it's what we call 5 working days. Some might be bigger, some might be 14 days, and you've seen adverts, you buy this as a 14-day money back, no quibbles guarantee. Basically, when you look at that, so what we call a statutory cancellation right. So everything you buy, you can have a cancellation right with every single thing. I'll get my words out in a minute. Okay, so that should do you quite well on those ones. Handover information. So what is a handover? A handover is where you are then handing the system over to the customer. So if I fitted a heating system, I've done all my work, I've commissioned it, it's all up and running and working, I'm going to hand the system over to the customer. This means that's it, we're job done. Handover could be the house, the plot, plot 25 on a building site has been completely finished, and the handover could be a handover to the client who's going to move in. It could be something like that, but that's what it means by the word handover. Okay, so state the importance of company policy and procedure that affects working relationships, bit of a mouthful there. Right, company policies and procedures, one's behaviour, timekeeping, dress codes, so on and so forth. I don't think I need to go through those with you, do I? I think they're quite obvious, behaviours on site, and it's being polite and respectful of everyone, isn't it, so on and so forth. Timekeeping, well, you know all about that, don't need to go through that. There will be some places with dress codes, so there will be some, if you're a plumber, for example, there'll be certain workwear that the company would give you, they expect you to wear rather than you wear your own, etc., etc. It's all about professionalism at the end of the day, isn't it? And that's the idea. Contracts of employments. Wherever you work, you should have a contract of employment, and that will give your contract of employment is everything that you've agreed to as part of that post, which includes sort of holidays, how you register sickness, and so on and so forth. And there's loads and loads and loads of it. Contracts are normally about that thick, just full of information, and always what I'd always say to you is always take the time to read them. Okay, you'll all have a contract of employment whether you're employed, because it has to be there by statutory legislation. That's the idea. And then it just talks about limits to personal authority, apprentices level 2, qualified staff and level 3, so on and so forth. Right, so if you're an apprentice working towards level 2, there'll be certain things you are allowed to do and not allowed to do. So for example, what you might not be allowed to do is to work with certain power tools. That might be the thing. So you might not be allowed to work with circular saws until you're deemed to be trained or you're over the age of 18, etc., etc. That's what it means to limit to personal authority. Did I say authority? Yeah, personal authority. And also, as a trainee, you wouldn't be talking to the customer saying, "Oh no, you want to have done this way, you want to do this way," because you're the trainee. You're the person that's learning the job, aren't you? You're not going to be doing that. When you get above level 2, and you get to level 3, a level 3 qualification is sort of supervisor and sort of manager. So the person you're probably working with, who's the plumber, would probably have a level 3 qual, and that's the person he liaises with the customer, and that's the whole idea of how that works and goes together. Okay, next one then, effective communication in work situation, oral communication. Oral communication is very quick, isn't it? It's very easy, hence why I do these videos, which probably gives you a clue with some of that. If there's somebody who has what we call ESOL, which is English Second or Other Language, it might be that you need an interpreter. That might be a way of doing it. If you've got somebody hard of hearing, there might be a different way in which you communicate. It might be through a family friend or something else that they can go through that with them, etc. So think about that. If it is an ESOL customer, you might need an interpreter, or they might have one there. I don't know. You see it quite often. You do see those all the time. Right, written communication, email, fax and letters. So for example, the most formal way to communicate someone out of those email, fax and letter is by producing a letter. If you wanted to complain, you would produce a written complaint in letter format. Now you might think, oh well, I don't do that, but you just attach it on an email, and I do agree with that. I get it, I'd understand. So if I wanted to put a complaint in, you could write a letter and attach it on an email and send the email, couldn't you? And I understand where you'd perhaps maybe get confused, but the letter is the way that you do a formal complaint. An email, if you think about what it is, it's usually, it can be something mandatory you have to do. I don't want to understate the gravitas of it, but emails are very quick and effective now, aren't they? As you know, because I send them a lot to you. A fax is hardly ever used now. Very, very old way of doing it. A fax would come through, so a fax machine, etc., etc. And you would have a document that would come through, and it would be faxed from your office to someone else's. Emails have took the place of fax, basically. Okay, effective communication with physical disabilities, learning difficulties, language difference, dialects, accents, foreign accents, and language issues. I think in that one we've probably covered it, to be fair, when we think about it. So for terms of communication, the bits we haven't looked at, physical disabilities, effective communication with someone with a physical disability, I always find that a bit strange. It's just because they have a physical disability doesn't mean they won't understand what you're saying. That's just my interpretation of what I'm just reading there. There's probably something to do with it, I'm pretty sure. Learning difficulties, again, it can be there, the comprehension and the understanding, so a family friend or somebody else might be able to do it. Language differences, dialects and accents as far as sounds and things, I think we've covered that when we were translators, so I don't think we need to go any further. Action to take when dealing with conflicts between customers and operatives, co-workers, supervisors and operatives. Okay, so if there's a conflict between a customer and an operative, what would you do? Well, you're the trainee, you can't really do a lot, can you? It's probably quite uncomfortable to be in that situation, but it would be reporting back to the manager is what would need to happen. If there's conflict with co-workers, you'd report it to your supervisor. There's nothing more you could do there. And supervisors and operatives, again, you'd speak to the manager. So they're easy, they're straightforward. And the last one. State the effects of poor communication may have an organisation between operatives and management, company to customer. If there's poor communication throughout, it's going to cause disharmony and disjointment, whichever it is, isn't it? And that's the problem. So communication can break down for lots of reasons. Not always deliberate. I'm pretty sure of that. But it's the communication has got to be effective, isn't it? However you choose to use it. For me, if I have a conversation with somebody, that's my most effective way, I think, of communicating. Sometimes, though, you might have to put something on an email because you want the same message going to everybody, and it might be somebody's interpretation of the email might be different to your interpretation of the email, and that's what you would perhaps say may be ineffective communication. Okay, but it's each to their own, and that's what it is. Okay, so that's the unit. Again, take the time to do your notes, as I've already said, and I hope that will sincerely help quite a bit with what you need to do. Please remember to use the revision software that I've set for you anyway, okay, and that will help you on top of this video. Okay, all the best in your exam. Take care. Speak to you soon.